Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. In our show today, we're going to take a look at something that we haven't really talked about much on this show yet. So I think this will be really interesting. We're going to focus more on industrial supply chain and talk about MRO and some serious issues with that and how AI can play into that. So I'm joined by Ross Sonnabend, Chief Product Officer and SVP Customer Success and Onboarding at Verusen. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here. I hope you had a great weekend.
Yeah, it was busy, but that's okay. I guess that's good, right?
Absolutely.
So why don't we just, to get started, why don't we just jump in and talk a little bit about, about yourself and your role at Verusen and kind of how you got there.
Yeah, it's been a great ride. It's an interesting ride. So I'm the Chief Product Officer and head of head of customer onboarding at Verusen. And my role is really about working with customers, understanding their needs, and then helping facilitate those needs in our software. It's an interesting space. It's not a space that I've been in before. In fact, in my career, I've been on the product side, but never in the same industry or same vertical, more than once, right? And so where I really spent my time is focusing on data analytics, and AI, and the evolution of AI from analytics to ML type techniques to agentic and generative AI, which is where we are today.
Cool. Yeah, that's good. I should say we got into this conversation because you guys had reached out and we were going through your solution a couple of weeks ago, and I got excited about it because, like I said, it's an area that I know well because I certainly came out of that maintenance world, but I haven't really looked at how AI is really having an impact there. So I think this will be a really interesting conversation around that. And I want to start in that deck. And when we were talking, you said MRO is $1 trillion problem. That's a big problem. So, and the market is expected to reach, almost 900 billion in 2028. So what's driving all that growth, and why has the industry been slow with their AI adoption so far?
So, before I got into this business, I didn't understand or know what MRO is either. MRO stands for maintenance, repair, and operations. And the easiest way to visualize and think about it is these are the materials, these are the assets, these are the parts that make manufacturing lines go, right? It's the motors, the bearings, the lubricants, and everything that is required for any industrial manufacturer to make their things. Our customers tend to be asset intensive manufacturers or businesses, so think CPG, oil and gas, think of energy, think of paper and pulp. All of these are industrialized businesses that have huge asset bases. And so why MRO is growing is really a confluence of a number of different factors, right? One is aging infrastructure. So, people install manufacturing lines, they're there for 10, 15, 20, 30 plus years. As those things age out, they have to replace them. That forces new purchases to happen kind of down that supply chain. The second is something that we all experienced in COVID, and it's just the supply chain volatility, right? There's a lot of dependency on materials to get these, for these companies to make whatever it is that they make. And what COVID taught them was that, probably some bad hygiene, and that it's better to have more stuff than it is to risk the cost of downtime, because downtime is very, very expensive, right? Measured in certain customers in millions of dollars by the minute. And then lastly, I think there's this confluence of both digital transformation, where everyone's rushing to digitize all of their operations, whatever that means. And then also that is combined with sustainability, where you have board level initiatives to make sure that companies are transforming, but in a responsible and sustainable way, which is another way of saying doing more with less, making sure that they are optimized, whatever that means. And so all of those things come together that are really driving the growth of the
Hmm, that's interesting. I told you when we chatted before that was involved in this area of software for a while when I first, well, in the Navy, and then after when I first came out. So I'd done a lot of implementation work, but that was in a long time ago, in the 90s. And in back then, even then it was such a critical problem, and yet there just weren't really a lot of good solutions. So, I was curious with everybody talking about AI transformation, how do you guys think about this when you're talking about purpose-built AI versus this kind of generic AI solutions that we've seen proliferate around everything over the last 3 years? And what makes your approach specifically well suited for the MRO world?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. I think first and foremost, we see generalized AI solutions in the marketplace in kind of two different ways. One is you see the generalized kind of chat-oriented GPT,
Mhm.
generative AI, which is consuming all of the world's information and making it accessible via chat, and it is a great research helper and it's great in doing a lot of other things. Um, but we haven't necessarily seen a lot of great applications of that yet in enterprise. I think, particularly in content generation, you're seeing that in places where it makes sense to have something that's generating something for you, right? Or in human assistance, co-pilot like solutions where you have coding or whatnot. All of those make sense. Um, I think the second area that you're seeing AI in the enterprise is through AI platforms, right? I won't name any of them out there. I think your viewers probably know who they are, but these are general purpose AI platforms that are really more toolkits or frameworks. They give you the ability to use tools to build AI models and or implement processes around AI, but you're not getting purpose built, i.e., specific for your use case kind of
Mm,
AI. And so, what Verusen is doing is purpose built AI for MRO, which is a very different model. It means when
mm,
you are a customer of Verusen, you don't spend time building models. You don't spend time really training a ton of models, right? We onboard your data, we learn from your data, and we immediately give you value, right? So it's less about interacting with the AI in like a chat oriented way. And it's really more about having task specific, MRO specific
mm,
models that give value. And one really good example of that is the material graph that we've built. The
mm,
material graph is a database of over 40 million MRO parts that we have information about. And think of the material graph as a you know flat database that goes out to the right at infinitum
mm,
in terms of characteristics of any one part. So as we
mm,
learn more about parts, we build something called our truth set. That truth set becomes what the rest of our solution is dependent on. And so when
mm,
we take customer data in, we normalize that data. It means you don't have to do a data cleanse. You don't have to do a project that takes 12, 18, 24 months just to get your data prepared to use our system.
mm,
And that's all because we've built what I call like a small language model that is very specific to MRO, right? And it uses these other techniques. It uses ML, it uses NLP, it uses LLMs, it uses agentic AI, but the base of it is this core set of data that is,
mm.
again, very specific to this MRO space.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think I've seen this across a lot of different domains over the last 6, 8 months, maybe a year, that people are moving more towards this idea of specialty, and particularly in sizing the model correctly for the application that you're using it for, rather than just thinking, oh, the large language model is going to solve all problems. I mean, I run a small model on my MacBook as well for because I deal with a lot of NDA kind of information from vendors. I don't want to let that leak out. I mean, I think it's a really interesting way to think about it. And the problem you're solving obviously is very specific to those use cases. So you talked about the knowledge graph, a material knowledge graph, I should say, and I know that you told me, and you consider this a real competitive differentiator. Can you talk a little bit more about how that sets you apart?
Yeah, so I think our use of AI in general is what sets us apart, and the material graph forms the basis for that. AI is great. All of these techniques are great, but you have to have a good set of data. And you can't just rely on customer data because the customer data, by their own admission, is not great. And so we spend a lot of time building up what we call, you know, our truth set. That truth set is kind of the verified information about every part that we know to be true because we've been able to trace it all the way back to the manufacturer of that. And we're abstracting that information, understanding that information. So at the very beginning, when a customer comes in and they give us their own data to ingest, we're able to look at that against our truth set and identify gaps, for example, identify places where we can help them, identify ways that we can also use their data to, enhance the ML model, not enhance, but to train the ML model so that it's more purpose built for them. And so
Mhm.
for us, that data forms the first building block. Anything else that we do, whether it is NLP work, LLM work, machine language models, or generative AI or agentic AI, all comes back to the data that you have, the quality of the data, the newness of the data, right? And then from there, everything else works. If you don't start with the data and you haven't solved that data problem, then everything else, it's garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. You know, we hear a lot about explainable AI, and I know that transparency around your AI, that sort of thing. And you guys you're using the term understandable AI. And one of the things I thought was interesting about this is that as a part of that, you explain the why behind all the recommendations that the engine would generate, right? So could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, how is that? How are you able to do that and really make this work effectively for MRO applications?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And yes, we just released a new capability called Explainability, which is really about helping our users understand why we made any recommendation that we made or why the AI made the decision that it made. And
Mhm.
again, we believe that you need to build that kind of transparency and trust from the ground up. It can't be bolted on later. It's really part of the company ethos about open and transparent AI. We want
Mhm.
customers to know why the decisions were made. So, what we've done is we spent a lot of time working with our customers to understand how they think about these decisions. And as we've done that, we've started to identify and hone in on let's call it 7 to 10 things that are important to them. It's things like lead time, it's things like how
Mhm.
many items they have in their facility and other facilities near them, right? It's things like what is the service level that's required and the criticality that's required. If you
Mhm.
are a skilled if you're a skilled person in this space, managing a storeroom or managing someone's inventory, these are the things that you're thinking about every day. And so what we've done is we spent a lot of time understanding that and then turning that into code that allows us to go back to the models that we've built and say, okay, every time we make a decision, we want to tell in plain English someone who's either skilled or unskilled at
Mhm.
inventory management why these decisions were made. Now, that's a little bit different than, you know, just general purpose AI explainability, which is a much different problem. But we're trying to solve the problem of an end user understanding the decision that was made, not necessarily a mathematician understanding the
Mhm.
nitty gritty of why a neural network made the decision that it made, which those are two
Mhm.
different, very different ones.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, but in this application, it seems like this is extremely important because of the potential for big impacts on their business, right? On uptime, on having the right materials at the right time, at the right place, that sort of thing. So that makes sense to me.
Absolutely. And it also is, we talked about the aging machinery in the workforce. There's also
Mm,
an aging workforce in general out there.
mm,
And as new people come on and take these jobs, we envision Verusen being a helping application for them, so where they are able to say, why
mm,
did this decision get made, and then understand that, go verify that to be sure. But we want the application to be very accessible and very usable by anyone, regardless of their time in industry or experience base.
mm. Yeah, some of the metrics you shared with me when we were talking about your solution were really impressive, and I quote a couple: nearly 15% reduction in working capital, almost 3% improvement in uptime. Which, if you're a manufacturer, 3% uptime is a massive improvement. I know
Yeah.
some people think 3%, that's a massive improvement. So that's amazing. So, do you have a customer story that you could share that illustrates a bit about how those metrics translate into, the impact for the customer?
Absolutely. So the customer that I'm thinking of is a healthcare manufacturer, right? They're a brand name, multi-billion dollar, tens of billions of dollars global organization, services kind of every nation in the world kind of thing. They are a household name. And they came to us and said our MRO is kind of out of control. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to get our hands on it, particularly because it is such a disparate, distributed organization, right? I mean, we've brought in 20 for this company, we brought in about 30 global sites, right, in their first wave, right? And so there's multiple implementations that they'll do, but in their first wave, 28 global sites, and they were experiencing process inefficiencies, stock outs, excess inventory, and they also had this problem where they couldn't see what everyone else had, right? So this
Mm,
whole idea of being able to share parts or buy from myself, they just weren't able to do any of that, right? And so when we did is we ingested their data again against from 28 different global sites. That's multiple languages, that's multiple ERPs, that's multiple versions of ERPs, right? So you're talking
mm,
about effectively 28 different systems that we've brought in.
mm,
We ingested that data, we applied the AI to hundreds of millions of dollars of on-hand inventory. I think across these 28 sites, it's about 200 million in on-hand inventory that we're looking at, and
mm,
surfaced $34 million in potential opportunities to save on day one, right? From
mm,
there, you know, our system requires that you review the recommendations that we make. And so in the first week, they found by reviewing 115 materials, they saved about $500,000, right? And then in the first 3 months, they verified that they saved a $2.5 million by
mm,
looking. And then they were also able to identify 6,200 materials that were at risk of stock out, and they were able to resolve that
mm.
before they actually experienced the stock out. So all of that comes together saying, this is how you get to your 15% working capital, reduction by optimizing your inventory, your
Mm,
3% inventory improvements. It's a lot of the time because people just can't get their hands around it. It's a hard problem to solve, particularly when you're looking across an organization. The ability, everyone has an ERP. Everyone has
right.
their ERP usually locked down so my one stock room can see my own stock room. But what happens if I stock out? Right? Then I'm calling a friend at a site that I know, and I'm
Yep.
trying to do a milk run or sending something to someone. We kind of break that model a little bit, and we give them the
Mm.
ability to see what's there, and that gives them a lot of opportunity, a lot of options that they just didn't see before.
That's interesting because I know just based on my very, very long time ago experience working with some of these companies, that was actually a big issue, right? They didn't know what they had and what they didn't have. And, the department that's, a block away or whatever in their compound might have exactly what they need, but they didn't have any way to know that, nor have a way to access it. So that has to be a huge benefit, particularly for a large enterprise customer that does have a lot of complexity.
Absolutely. They today, people know more about what they have. They don't necessarily know about the state of what they have.
Mm,
So, obsolescence is a huge issue here. Sharing materials between sites is a huge issue, mainly for two reasons. One is each site may not know what they have, but then there's other corporate policies that have been enacted over
mm,
time that also maybe don't necessarily facilitate those kinds of processes. And that's another part of what we enable. A lot of what we enable is the value based on what's in the application. But then when people start using the application, they start seeing business process efficiencies that they can get and new opportunities by adjusting business processes to fit the the technology that exists now.
yeah. Yeah, we don't always think about that way. I think, a lot of companies have gone into this with enterprise software for years going, what's our process? How do I make that process function in some automation, some system? And what you're saying now is because of the capabilities, we're actually going to modify our process to be more effective and more efficient because I now have visibility. I now have controls that I didn't have in place before. Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
that's huge.
We had a customer tell us once, I feel like I've discovered plutonium, but I don't know what to do with it. And that's it puts it into high relief, right? Because this is a big part of, we consider ourselves like a vertical application, right? It's very focused on MRO, and so a lot of the times our customers implement our software, and now they're like, now what do I do? Right? How does this really change and impact the organization? And so, that's something else that we help our customers with in terms of like the initiatives that they put forth as a result of our application, is a really important part of how they get to value.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, one of the things that, I kind of jumps out at me as we're talking about these larger enterprise customers is sort of a network effect that you could see in this. And I know you talked about that a little bit too, network sharing, I think you guys call it, in sort of a hub and spoke model. So can you talk about how that creates value for your customers?
Well, we've spoken about it already a little bit in that, today most customers are very focused on what's happening within their storeroom. So if I've got a large multinational
Mm,
company, they may have 30, 50. We have a customer that has 650 storerooms across their network, so to speak. That's all internal to them, but it doesn't mean that they can see what their neighbor is doing. And so this concept of network sharing, initially with us, it's sharing within your four walls. It's like, what does my counterpart 3 cities over have in their
mm,
facility? And if I need it, how fast can I get it? Right. So we actually allow customers to set up virtual networks, hub and spoke
mm,
models, for example, or centralized distribution models, where they can model out on a material category basis, on a location basis, what kinds of networks can I set up? Should
mm,
I set up a network for my electrical parts in these 3 cities because
mm,
they're very close and they use a lot of electrical parts? We allow you to do that, which you haven't been able to do before because it's computationally
yeah,
very
totally.
intensive. It's
Yeah.
really hard to do the permutations to figure out, okay, 3 cities over, I've got this problem. 1 city over, I have this problem. These people are overbuying over here, they're underbuying over there.
Mm,
And how do you do that for every part when you're talking about 250,000 SKUs that you're managing with hundreds of parts associated with each one of those things? It's a huge problem. So that's what we enable. We enable you to
mm,
set up these virtual networks and think about the impact, model the impact, potentially implement the impact without having to go do a lot in the real world. Once you've implemented it, once you've modeled it and implemented it, then what we found, as we were just talking about, that drives other process change. Like, for
Yeah.
example, we have a customer that had 30 storerooms and a decentralized decision making model where every storeroom was making their own decisions. They implemented Verusen. 3 years later, they have moved to a more centralized model where instead of you have 30 people making these decisions, you have four people making these
Mm.
decisions, and the other 26 people are now focused on uptime, running the storeroom, running that manufacturing facility. So, they're kind of out of doing some of the bureaucracy and more on
Mm.
focusing on uptime and some of these other things. So that's how network sharing really, really helps.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the visibility obviously would be great, but if you could create, it's almost like you can create a different system if you can create a sharing model that lets you move things around. Because I know financially that was always an impediment with companies like, oh, well, we're just going to work out this backroom deal because we can't
Right.
because we don't have a way to transfer the part from one part of the building to the other or whatever, right? So yeah,
Yeah,
that's interesting.
absolutely.
So I'm curious about kind of where this is going, and we talked a bit about some of the capabilities you have right now. Obviously, this material graph's a big piece of your current value and offering, but I know that we see this kind of progress with agents and autonomy and agency over time. So how are you guys thinking about the maturity of this space and your product in this space and where you think this is going to go?
It's a great question, and I think there's, like we were talking about at the very beginning, there's a lot of different AI techniques out there. There's a lot of different approaches out there. A lot of the times that new technologies are new, people suddenly feel like they have a hammer and everything's a nail.
Yeah.
We start off as saying, we don't want to build technology for technology's sake. We want to build technology that adds value to
Mhm.
our user base and to our customer base. And so, where we start is, what's the problem that we're trying to solve, number one, and what's the right set of techniques to use, right? Because no
Mhm.
technique is bad, they're just bad applications of it. So,
Right.
so that being said, at a macro view, we're moving towards, and we want to move our customers towards autonomy.
Mhm.
Autonomy is out there in the future at some undefined point, but there's a lot of steps between now and then, and you have to look at it at a business process basis. So we started with the data. Then we noticed there's two different types of problems to solve. There are data problems where you're talking
Mhm.
about the normalization of data, the correction of data, things that normally take either humans or another technology that's using rules to put together
Right.
a data cleansing project. So we see agentic AI and generative AI as a place to apply those types of problems. Why?
Mm.
Especially on the agentic side, because they're single task problems. If I need to always correct supplier names or I always need to normalize categories, that's one thing that you can build an agent to do. It's
Mm.
always doing it 24/7. And if you build the right type of agent with the right type of models, as it gets more data, it's improving and adds more value. So that's the first type, and that's where we are already doing that today with explainability. We have some other things that where we're doing that in the pipe as well, and then secondarily, we do see another type of agent which I call job specific agent, but again, it's very specific to one task, right? So
Mhm.
reviewing inventory optimization recommendations, accepting inventory recommendations, looking for obsolete materials,
Mhm.
identifying materials that should belong in a network, looking for things that are bought off of a free text PO or non-stock
Mhm.
item and identifying what should be stocked. These are tasks that, in all honesty, a lot of the time are not high value tasks in and of themselves. The value is the output of the task. right?
Right.
Now I know what's obsolete. It's not identifying from 250 SKUs what is obsolete. It's knowing what is obsolete. And
Right.
so that's where we're headed. We're headed to build these task specific tools that allow technology to be a force multiplier, give the user leverage, and at the same time, not X out the user. We don't look at the user as an annoyance. We look at the user as a very important part of a human in the loop equation here. And
Mhm.
so we want machines to help give leverage, to be a force multiplier, and then have humans being able to look at exceptions, look at things that the machine isn't very well trained to do, and really give the spotlight to the human, to the operator, to be able to say, you have knowledge and expertise that the system doesn't have. We need you to focus your time on these very high value problems versus looking at something that's, a $500 part.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it sounds like and we talk about this in almost every agentic, conversation that I have lately. This moving a kind of a progression of autonomy and eventually agency, but there's, each decision point is what's the human involvement, what's the data and metadata available, and is it the right thing, is the right quality, and then what's the output of that decision, and at what point do you trust the agent enough to loosen that and let them do more of the task or automate more of the tasks. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think that people don't fully grasp the level of change that we're really looking at and how
Yeah.
it, but I look at it as generational, right? I think it's a 25, 30, 40 year kind of change that's going to happen. So, it's not all going to happen overnight. What is going to happen more overnight is task specific stuff that you give trust to over time. That's why things like explainability are important. That's why things like transparency are important because you have to expect that your user base isn't going to trust the system until you, just like any relationship, until you earn the trust. And so you give that trust every time a decision's made that you either agree or disagree with, but you understand. And the more that
Mhm.
you can build that understanding, it's like building a relationship with a coworker or a person. All we want is for users to build their trust and then say, you know what? I trust that we've trained this enough to make this decision. Now let's go do another decision. And I think you have to look at it kind of decision by decision, and over time you build that trust. I think
Mhm.
where people will go wrong is if you don't spend that time investing in that
Yeah.
relationship, building that trust and transparency.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I feel like I'm a small business, so I use a lot of agents. But it's funny when you start to go into it. Like I have a scheduling agent, and that sounds like a really simple thing, but my business is based on having meetings, meeting with clients, meeting with prospects, meeting with vendors to learn about what they're doing. And so for me, that's a trust issue. If it doesn't work correctly with my client, it could cause, a lot of downstream damage to the business. But now I trust the agent completely because I watched it for a while. I, would insert myself a couple of times to see, and now I know how it works and why it works, and I trust it. And that's a simple thing, but each one of these use cases, I feel like that's where we have to get to. We have to be able to demonstrate this successfully and at the same time understand the risk and how you mitigate the risk and how much human involvement do you need and how does that change. I mean, it's a three-dimensional problem, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think people forget that people who build technology tend to forget this trust component because
Yeah.
your schedule is a very intimate thing. It's very you that's a great example. So are these decisions that we're talking about. They're intimate
Hmm.
decisions. Why? Because in your case your livelihood's dependent on having things scheduled and that you don't
Hmm.
want collisions, right? Because that
Right.
causes credibility issues for you.
Yeah.
Same thing with our end users. Our end users are worried about things like making the right decision so that their uptime is impacted. Ultimately, at some level, bonuses are impacted, job security is impacted. And so people care about these decisions that are being made. they're not trivial decisions. Every micro decision that we make in some way, shape, or form is important. And if you build technology and you're not treating it that way,
Mhm.
that's where I think people run into problems.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, talking about the path to automation, the path to agency, and how you make that progression. You know, I know people are excited about agentic AI. They're excited about the capability to automate, but at the same time, you've got to work through this in a structured way to make sure that what you're implementing has the right outputs, and you can put the right goals and right objectives in front of the agent, but then do you get what you expect out of it on a regular basis? And if there's an exception, how does the human play into that, and approve it or change it or take it over, or whatever the level of involvement might be? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think when people are building technology or evaluating technology, looking at those guardrails are super important,
Mhm.
right? When we build these solutions, we have a number of guardrails that we build in, from human in the loop, so we get feedback on the models themselves, to workflow where we treat the agent as though it's just another worker, and that their boss is a human that is reviewing a digestible
Mhm.
version of the decisions that they're making. Think of an agent making 5,000 decisions, and then the boss gets something that says this agent just made these 5,000 decisions that have these characteristics. Do you agree with all of them, or do you want to look at each individual one? Right,
Right.
all the way up through. You know what? For this stuff, we don't want an agent making these decisions. Right,
Right.
if you build those safeguards in, and you should be building those safeguards in, then I think this becomes a lot less scary. I think it becomes a lot more approachable. I think the other thing is you have to look at any of these things that you're doing on a continuum of risk. So it's like,
Mhm.
maybe like for us, we started with explainability. Why did we start with explainability? Because we believe in trust and transparency, but
Mhm.
also because there's no decision that's involved with that. A user can completely ignore that explanation and make their
Mhm.
own decision. We ask for feedback on that, but that's a very different type of decision or interaction than when you have someone who's going to say, like, I no longer want to stock this part. Do you agree or disagree with that? Because now all of a sudden, if the manufacturing line goes down and it points back to this person is making that decision, or this AI is making that decision, it comes back to me, there's a totally different set of implications there.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
why I think when we look at it as back to agency and autonomy and all of those things, the things that are easy, that you start with are the easy decisions or the low
Mhm.
risk decisions, and you work your way up through trust and transparency to those more difficult and more intimate, harder decisions.
Yeah. I mean, you brought up something that I'm a big proponent of, and I think this is a great way for companies to think about this. And that's this concept of treating it like a digital workforce. How do you manage, how do you build, how do you use and operate a digital workforce that is a collaborative entity with your human workforce? And over time, you've got to build a collaborative model between those two to get the outcomes that you're looking for in different levels of involvement and autonomy and trust and all those things, right? But those are all a part of, even just a simple thing of, and if the agent makes a bad decision, who's responsible,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's an
Yeah, I think
important question.
that operating model, I mean, look, I have a consulting background, right? That's
Mhm.
kind of a good old fashioned operating model discussion. It's
Yep.
like, I work with this group over here, and they have this group over here. How do we all work together to get to a better, more efficient outcome? It really, in some ways, is motherhood and apple pie. It's not that different. It's just from an agentic perspective, you're changing the worker from the guy that's sitting next to you, shoulder to shoulder, to a
Mhm.
machine. And I know that sounds weird and crazy to some people, but it is just another worker at that level.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and you have all the same issues, and I think this is something people don't think through, right? How do you hire that digital employee, right? You need to understand what you want it to do and what you want the outputs to do. Are you going to build it? Are you going to, buy one from a marketplace? Is it, there are all these different decision points that I think are really important. So yeah, to me, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so we're really getting close to the end of our time. A great conversation. Before I let you go, one of the things I'd like to get is a recommendation for the audience, just somebody that you think would be interesting for them to check out, like a thought leader, or maybe it's a blogger, a podcast, an author that you think would help, in this conversation around AI and autonomy.
It's a great question. I actually have just been reading a book called The Scarcity Mindset by
Mhm.
Michael Easter, who also
Mhm.
put something else, another book out called The Comfort Crisis.
Yep.
These are more like social psychology types of books, but as we're thinking about AI, I think really understanding habits, scarcity, and how those things play into the mindset of a user is
Mhm.
is super important. More important than in many cases more important than the textbook, like here's an AI
Mhm.
model to learn about. Like this
Right.
really becomes a study in human behavior more than it is a study in comp sci in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's an interesting point too. That we're working in a world where, if you think of this as a digital workforce, you really are looking for a different approach to this. It's not just about the underlying technology, because you're really creating this collaborative model that has an impact across your whole workforce, your business, your customers, everything. So yeah, that's a great recommendation. I appreciate that. And Ross, really, I appreciate you joining today. Great conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me here. Had a great time. We hope to do it again.
Hey, sounds good. And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arianresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arianresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arian Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.